Jesus was a biblical Jew, not a Talmudic Jew. That fails so hard.
Now, I need to address what was said in this video, but first, I'll start by saying I appreciate the thoughtful contributions you bring to this platform, Rabbi Morty, even though we may disagree in certain spots. You certainly hold a lot of Protestant Christians accountable when you mention to them that Yeshua or Jesus taught the law of Moses and did not abrogate the law of Moses, but rather taught its continuation. So, the claims that you make in this video involve this idea that if the New Testament uses certain phrases that we cannot derive from Tanakh per se, then that means that they were derived from the Talmud. There are a couple problems with this. Number one, the Talmud was compiled after the New Testament, so that would be anachronistic to make such a statement. And number two is you're assuming that these phrases aren't attached to any specific concepts in the Tanakh. Now, just because the phrase isn't in the Tanakh does not mean that the concept being described isn't in the Tanakh. The first phrase that I recall you using is evil eye. Now, I don't recall the New Testament mentioning anything about the evil eye, so I'm not sure if you meant eye for eye, which is directly from the Torah, or if you meant the ancient Mesopotamian tradition stemming from 5,000 years ago, actually called the evil eye. Now, I'm not here to go over what the evil eye is, but you can find it in Greco Roman or a bunch of Middle Eastern traditions. Now, the second thing that you stated is that the resurrection of the dead is a concept from the Talmud. Now, I don't believe this is accurate simply because we read about the Valley of Dry Bones, for example, or even Eov or Job asking Elohim, "Will I wake up from this sleep again?" And of course, I think that's presented more as a rhetorical in Job chapter 14. And then we have clearer resurrection theology in Job chapter 19. In addition, Daniel chapter 12, verses 1 through 2 is very clear that there will be a resurrection of the dead at the end of the age. So I think this is something you can actually glean from the prophets and the writings. You don't necessarily need the Talmud. The Talmud might have discussions on resurrection, but that is not where the concept originates from. Then the next thing you mention as something being from the Talmud is the Malkut Shemayim. Now, I have a problem with this because, once again, this is a phrase that's being used to describe a concept that's already present in the Tanakh. Is the phrase Malkut Shemayim present in the Hebrew Bible? By no means. But is it a descriptor for things that we find in the Hebrew Bible? Yes, absolutely. And another thing I need to mention is that the term rabbi isn't even a concept that we find in Tanakh. It's actually first employed in the New Testament before it even arrives as something that's employed in the Talmud. In addition, rabbis cannot claim originality for the resurrection of the dead idea because there were already non Abrahamic frameworks for this, such as with the Egyptians and Osiris, and with other religions and Baal. Then you state that Kava Chomer is something that you would derive from the Talmud. Now, it is true that both Yeshua and later rabbinic scholars used this form of argument to make halakhic rulings from the Torah. However, it would be more true to say that this kind of argumentation originated with the New Testament before it ever came to be in the Talmud. The evidence of this is Yeshua's argument with the Pharisees, where he basically says, if you're able to rescue a donkey from a ditch, how much more a human on the day of the Sabbath? Now, for those of you guys who don't know, Kava Homer means if something is true in a lesser case, it must also be true or applicable in a greater case. It literally means light and heavy, and it's used not just in this example of the New Testament, as cited by several Messianic scholars, it's also used in the case where Yeshua asks the question of if parents give gifts to their children even while they're evil, how much more will our Father give to his children when they ask him of things? And no, Kava Chomer is not a license to sin, it's not a license to disobey, especially in Luke chapter 14 and verse 5. It's just the phrase, how much more? Question mark. Now, you also mention this idea that Yeshua says to obey the spirit of the law rather than the letter of the law. However, I will say Yeshua never makes this claim himself. This is actually a Pauline form of argumentation. And for all you Protestants out there, no, when Paul makes that statement, he's not doing away with the law at all. That requires hermeneutics, that requires exegesis and dissection, which I'm actually not going to do on this video. I'm going to have to pull that off some other time. But what I will say is that that phrase, spirit of the law, is as Pauline as the tautological incomplete statement, the free gift of salvation. Then you mentioned that there's this idea of Gehinom and that this originates in the Talmud as well. However, I do have a challenge to this as Yeshua makes a reference to the Valley of Hinnom. And not only that, but the Tanakh itself talks about the idolatry and child sacrifice practices that involved fire specifically in that area. That is to say, that according to these references, which I'm going to display on the screen, the idea of Gehinom is dated back to much earlier than the Talmud was compiled. Then you also mentioned that this idea of a camel passing through a needle's eye being easier than one getting into the kingdom of heaven is something from the Talmud. However, it was an ancient Near Eastern idiom used to describe something that was just completely impossible. Again, before the Talmud was compiled. And not only that, but the Talmud doesn't contain, as far as I'm aware, any references to a camel going through the eye of a needle. Instead, as you can see from these sources, which are going to be displayed on the screen, it uses an elephant as an example rather than a camel. So, once again, this does not justify the arguments that Yeshua and his disciples were Talmudic disciples and a Talmudic Messiah, or a Talmudic teacher, if you will, because as I understand it, you do not believe that Yeshua was the Messiah. And then regressing back to the spirit of the law point, I never finished that, but when Paul said that, once again, that's not a Talmudic phrase, that's a Pauline phrase. Then you might have also mentioned that love your neighbor as yourself is also Talmudic. I have a major problem with this because when Yeshua said, love God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself in Matthew chapter 22, he was making very clear statements that already come from the Torah. When he said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, that comes from the Shema, Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verse 4. And of course, you can't love God with all your heart, soul, and mind unless you are obeying what he says, not just hearing what he says. Secondly, the love your neighbor as yourself is a clear Leviticus chapter 19 reference. You can read about it in verses 17 through 19 in particular. So again, this goes back to the revelation at Sinai. This is not something that can be dated to the first or second or even third centuries common era. I mean, it's just kind of like the people who try to use the Zohar as an authoritative text and then read it into earlier texts and earlier prophecies and earlier requirements. Keep our brother, I suppose, Rabbi Alon Anava in prayer because he believes that according to the Zohar, the Mashiach is going to have 3,000 disciples as soon as he comes, and that that's an additional qualifier for one being the Messiah. And I'm just going to mention this because of how important it is. Just like we need to keep Alon Anava in our prayers, just like we need to keep Rabbi Morty in our prayers, we should also be keeping David and Rivka in our prayers. They recently blocked me because they want to follow their own Talmudic program instead of Yeshua's program, which refers ultimately back to the Tanakh. And since Alon Anava could not provide us with a chapter and verse for this idea that the Mashiach will have 3,000 students when he first comes to earth, let's go to Isaiah chapter 11 and verse 9, which is a chapter and verse that actually speaks against what he said. It says, for the earth shall be full of the knowledge of Yehovah, as the waters cover the sea. In other words, why is this describing a universal knowledge of God and a saturation of the world in divine knowledge as soon as Mashiach comes, if he is originally constraining himself to teaching a cult of 3,000 members? And in the day when Mashiach comes, many peoples, I assume more than 3,000, shall come and say, come, let us go up to the mountain of Yehovah, that he may teach us his ways. And I believe Isaiah 2:3 is rather about millions upon millions of people, never mind 3,000. Shalom.